activism and community work with community organizations, or cultural studies, or as our speaker spoke of in his work, the kind of intersection between those things. There's a pedagogy, a research component, an activism component to all of this kind of work. So we have 3 speakers to help illuminate some of this for us today, and each one will speak for something like 12 minutes or so. And we have with us today Maryam Nabavi, and wave to the people. Maryam is a PhD candidate in educational studies, and she's done quite a bit of work on community-based activism, especially with youth, and she works in the area of cultural studies. And we also have Shauna Butterwick. Yes, Shauna teaches in the same department as myself, educational studies. She does research in engaging with community and solidarity with community organizations. And she's involved in helping UBC think or rethink its relationships with communities. This is all part of what we've been talking about and touched on by AIbrahim in his keynote address. And she's done work with, she's currently doing research work with Filipino Women's Center. And speaking of that center, we have Marilou Carrillo with us today, who is an educator and a community activist. She works on issues with Filipino migrant workers. She's on the board of the Filipino Women's Center. And they'll speak in that order. Maryam for about 12 minutes or so. Shauna, again, 12 minutes. Marilou. And Marilou will have the last word. Right? Okay. 12 minutes or so. Shauna, again, 12 minutes. Marilou. And Marilou will have the last word. Right? Okay. So
thank you. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that we are an unceded First Nations territory of the Musqueam people, and I give thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today. Can you hear me okay? I'd also like to thank RAGA and CCIE for creating a space of dialogue and to handle Right for the invitation to be on the panel today. And a special thanks to my colleagues, Philip and Patrick, for listening to my talk this morning with my feedback. And I will be reading quite a bit of it as well, with some images. So I'll be speaking about my research, where I explore issues of identities, belonging, and experiences of citizenship with migrant youth in Canada. I engage with the idea of citizenship beyond legal, civil, political dimensions to consider sociological components such as identity, participation, belonging, virtues, civic attitudes, knowledge, and social structures, which inform how social structures inform how these issues are taken up within the context of citizenship. Insights into these aspects of citizenship, which can be framed broadly under social citizenship, provide a good starting point for considering how citizenship is a process of learning that is informed by everyday context. An exploration of social citizenship can be a useful tool for considering models of teaching and learning, and in the context of today's discussion, how service learning, which is broadly committed to teaching and learning within community context, but it's much more than that, as we know, can be positioned within a cultural studies praxis that considers the everyday as a political site. In my work, I argue that on the one hand, for immigrant youth in Canada, their experiences of citizenship are constituted within globalized contexts of different forms and often multiple migrations, and access to an array of contesting social, cultural, and political worlds, irrespective of geographic borders. And on the other hand, their experiences of citizenship are constituted by ideologies underpinning the multicultural nation, such as framed within liberal democratic understanding of national identities and belongings. In many ways, this is a site of tension in their lives. Through exploration into different dimensions of their lived experiences of a small sample of young immigrants, I have begun to unpack these nuanced tensions and how the participants in my study situate their experiences with social citizenship. I will provide a snippet of my doctoral research that entailed an ethnographic study with 12 first-generation Iranian immigrants between the ages of 19 and 29 in Vancouver metropolis. In the piece that I'll be discussing today, I will shed light on some specific sense wherein citizenship is learned and how their learning for citizenship is a process in which they're politicized. I will first do this through a discussion of the recent presidential elections in Iran in 2009 and how participants' engagement with this very political process in effect politicized them. I will also provide insights into their cultural context by drawing on their experiences with language, which we were speaking about earlier, which brings to bear issues of identity and belonging. Together, these seemingly yet overlapping contexts provide a good starting point to tease out how, for this population, social justice and cultural studies practice can inform service learning. So to begin, I'd like to begin with a popular chant that was spoken by Iranians in Iran not too long ago. It went as follows: Natarsid, natarsid, ma hame ba ham hastim. Don't be afraid, we are all together. This chant echoed throughout Iran as thousands of civilians poured into the streets of major cities throughout the nation to protest the outcome of the June 12, 2009 presidential elections. The collective call to not fear was for freedom of expression, democracy, equal opportunities, and social, political, cultural, and economic rights. The demonstrations were unique, not only because they were the largest in Iran's post-revolutionary history, or that it was young people who led the demands for change, just as was the case in Egypt not too long ago. It was unique because of the global nature of the call for change. The Iranian diaspora played a significant role in creating awareness of the Iranian civil rights movement in places as far from Tehran as Tokyo and as close as Istanbul. The movement for change, started by young Iranians in Iran, with young Iranians across the globe joining in, was coined the Green Movement. The movement's name was ignited as green was the campaign color of the forerunning challenger during the elections, and green eventually came to symbolize an international unity for those asking for change in Iran. In light of the emergence of the Green Movement during the fieldwork period of my study, interview and informal discussions often turned to the events surrounding the elections. Today, I'll first provide an overview of those who are actively involved in the Green Movement before moving on to how participants' use of language is also an expression of citizenship. The insights gained from these two areas are a useful point of entry for considering the ways that political choices are themselves expressions of citizenship. In other words, for participants, their activism in the Green Movement and their use of language overlap in that they are both politicized by virtue of how they are negotiated within the diaspora. So a number of the research participants in the study who were actively involved in the Green Movement, while they recognized that their activist efforts would not necessarily create change in Iran, they are compelled to be involved. They discussed the ways in which their involvement is driven for patriotism for Iran, a sense of citizen identity, an affirmation of their Iranian identity, and a search for belonging. For example, Bahar, who has not had a politicized life, shares that while she is not politically active, her involvement in the Green Movement gives her a sense of purpose and belonging. She later mentions that she closed her Facebook account during the post-election visit to Iran as it had political content and she feared she would be unable to leave the country when she went for a holiday. So while she joined the Green Movement as a way to belong, she was ultimately politicized in the process. Similarly, Shauna shares that involvement in the Green Movement created a sense of belonging which was facilitated by social mediums such as Facebook that offered news, a place to gather, and a place to belong to the collective. She says, Facebook changed everything when the political breakdown happened because a lot of videos were being posted. It became our media, it became our news source. Instead of people waking up in the morning and going to the BBC website, we were going to Facebook to check the news. More common, however, is a desire to demonstrate that they were unwilling to let geographic distance and period of time they had lived outside of Iran determine their loyalty and commitment to the imagined Iran of their past. Activist commitments are rooted in a strong anti-revolutionary discourse that has been pervasive in their lives, and in most cases, a driving force for their parents' emigration. For example, Donia expresses her patriotism as she passionately articulates that her activism is an effort to create a perfect Iran, albeit it's an Iran that she's never actually experienced. She says, "I want this imaginary country to be real for me, at least. I have this idea of a perfect Iran for myself, and I want it to be that. I want my kids to go, to feel free, to go back and forth, to feel comfortable, to love their country. You know what I'm saying? That's what I want." So involvement in the Green Movement gives pause to consider how diverse political expressions contribute to the broader ways in which citizenship is performed. One that is connected to a sense of nationalism. Participants are careful about how they articulate their Iranian national identity. On the one hand, they renounce an Iranian national identity as they do not align themselves with the anti-Western, anti-democratic ideologies driving the regime. And on the other hand, they claim a strong national identity, which is informed by cultural connections rooted in an imagined Iran. This is indicative of the ways in which an Iranian national identity is a site of tension, where the current context is not desirable and the alternative is only imagined. So living in a multicultural nation, this tension is further complicated. Discourses of multiculturalism in Canada, which focus on the celebratory aspects of culture and nationalities, such as possessing a dual citizenship, undermine the ways in which national identities can exist beyond official citizenship. Thus, for those who have chosen to be political, the possibilities they are afforded through the Green Movement enables a new way to be a hyphenated Iranian-Canadian citizen, and more than just citizenship or acknowledgement of cultural differences. So for the first time in their lives, they articulate that they can exercise citizenship duty where their hyphenated national identities are concerned. They can reap the benefits of the diaspora as a space to safely articulate their politics while being able to unsilence how their Iranian national identity is popularly depicted in their multicultural context. So I'd like to now shift into a description of the role in language in situating identities and belonging, and how that can be used as a site from which to launch service learning praxis. Participants draw on language as both a tool for communication as well as a tool for engaging with the cultural everyday. Together, these provide insights into how language is used as an expression of citizen identity and, by extension, citizenship. In his description of the context in which he uses Farsi and English, Salar points to the ways in which language is not just a tool for communication, but also a tool to assert different aspects of his identity based on hierarchy of who he is speaking with. Additionally, it is a tool that facilitates socialization with his friends, as he describes through their idiosyncratic dialect of Farsi and an accent. He says, "Nima, he's half white, half Irani, and we probably speak a mixture of probably 75% English, 25% Farsi. My brother, we speak English to each other. The group of high school kids, we go on and off, English, Farsi, English, Farsi. We've known each other for so long, we almost have our own dialect." So there was a time when we make fun of the Farsi accent so much that it started to stick, and we noticed it going into college. So in making fun of the Farsi accent, Salar is asserting his nuanced diaspora identity, both linguistically and culturally. He recognizes that an accent is an indicator of ethno-linguistic identity and, in effect, the degree of integration in Canada. Making fun of the Farsi accent enables him to assert the heterogeneity of the Iranian diaspora and accordingly situate himself within that. On the one hand, a linguistic reading suggests that his facetious engagement with the accent is a socialization process where he can kind of regress to the accent of those Iranians who are less integrated in Canada, such as his parents. But on the other hand, a cultural reading of his description that the accent stuck suggests that it was not the accent itself that stuck, but rather the habit of the accent that stuck. Through both his capacity to speak Farsi and English with ease and go as far as teasing out the nuances of the Farsi accent with his friends, Salar highlights that not only is he not burdened by language barriers or an accent, but he can assert a citizen identity driven by linguistic and cultural hierarchies. I'll provide a quick another example. It arose when I was at a participant's birthday party when the Iranian crowd was speaking a mixture of Farsi and English throughout the evening. A birthday card was being passed around and signed by a number of people. One person made a spelling mistake on the card, and it was brought to the attention of everyone else at the table. Rather than writing liar, L-I-A-R, he had written L-I-E-R in the card. His mistake resulted in malicious laughter as the phonetic reading of the word was akin to how one would say the word with a Farsi accent. So the laughter continued as people began speaking English with a thick Farsi accent, taunting him as they said, liar, over and over again. So while most of the people at the table had immigrated to Canada within the last 10 years, they're generally more comfortable speaking Farsi, and all of them speak English with an accent, with a Farsi accent. So thus they consider an accent to be an impediment of a sort and construct hierarchies of diaspora identity and the extent to which one is not Canadian enough. So there's this fine line of not being too Iranian, but at the same time not being too Canadian, that they're always having to negotiate. So what I'm suggesting is that language is not only a marker of Iranian or Canadian identities, rather the ways in which participants engage with language are politicized expressions of social and cultural identity and belonging and performance. The combination of moving between language, the meanings and interpretations, ascribed to accents and perceived relationship between being able to speak English and level of integration provide insights into the ways that language is a politicized site of performing citizenship. Using this understanding, we can start to unpack how a politicized diaspora youth population is implicated in the context of service learning. Critical models of service learning that consider the social, historical, cultural backdrop in which learners are embedded are useful for transcending linear hierarchical approaches of service learning to one that considers the wider socio-political context. In the context of the examples I've provided, this would include the ways in which a diaspora politics plays out in the lives of young immigrants, and how national and cultural identities and belongings are taken up within a multicultural nation. Practically, models that include a commitment to anti-racist, anti-colonial, and critical global citizenship education, for example, enable a shift from this charity model of service learning to one that is grounded more in a social justice framework. Additionally, approaches to service learning must be grounded in political and cultural context and the sociological dimensions of learners' experience, such as describing how participants use language and socialize. In a sense, the relationship between power, oppression, meaning-making, and outcomes are all embedded in a critical approach to service learning. So what I'm highlighting is that a practical social justice approach and a more conceptual cultural studies lens provides a sound starting point for challenging conventional models of service learning, which shift the focus from the benefits that it yields to the students to one that benefits the broader community, from charity to social justice, from shifting teaching and learning as a binary to one that is more iterative and experiential. This approach opens the possibility for transformative learning, and in the context of this study, an approach to citizenship that moves beyond conventional state-driven approaches to citizenship learning, that considers the socio-political context and ways in which learning citizenship is itself a political process.
So I also want to thank Musqueam peoples on whose land this wonderful place, this also learning exists, and also UBC, and also thanks to RAGA and CCIE for organizing this series. Thanks to all of those involved behind the scenes as well. And I particularly want to thank Awad, whose ideas really got me very excited about some ideas for sort of service learning. So this paper is based on my encounter with community service learning, an encounter with learning as a CSL as it is in the literature, and also how it's articulated within CSL units at Canadian universities, including UBC. And it's also grounded in my recent experiences of co-teaching with Jennifer Chan, a CSL graduate level course this term, which is still operating. Although I would not have used the term CSL, since beginning my tenure track position at EDST, I have also supported many individual graduate students who have undertaken some form of community engagement projects as part of their program that I think could be described in this as community engagement. The word service I'm going to pause on. I was drawn to CSL through the research undertaken by one of my doctoral students, Megan Burgee, who was involved in the early days at UBC. And she indeed wrote her 2005 dissertation on CSL through a critical race theory lens, and I recommend it to you. I also want to acknowledge the work of Pierre Walter, who is a colleague in the department, who has also written about CSL from an adult education perspective. And he was a key player, along with Jennifer, in initiating the course that we're currently teaching. So as an adult educator, professor in this field, and someone with a long-standing interest in respectful and mutually beneficial university relations, community relations, I am intrigued, sometimes excited, sometimes very concerned about CSL. And the biggest question I have always is whose interests are being served? And there's no one answer to this in any even individual case. And the question, one response could be, it depends, which is not a very satisfactory answer. So some of the other questions that I'm working with in my investigation is, how is the learning that takes place in community service learning understood and theorized? Two recurring ideas permeate the entire CSL literature. One, that experiential learning is the foundation and it's just always good, and that CSL learning is transformative. All of the discussions, almost all of the discussions I encountered in literature still looked at learning in a very individualistic fashion, and there was little attention given to learning as social interaction or learning that was liberatory, as outlined by theorists such as Freire and feminist scholars. I'm not going to go into my exploration of the learning theory in this literature at this point. Two other questions that I have about community service learning, or how is community perceived, and how are the community members viewed by the university in particular? Is community knowledge and pedagogy recognized and valued? Does CSL contribute to communities? And does it recognize community capacities? And finally, how does a social justice orientation inform the discussion? So I got an HSSC grant last year and began with Rain Daniels' assistance reviewing the literature, and I wanted to acknowledge Rain's wonderful work. She has prepared a very detailed annotated bibliography of the literature, and she's also done a survey and gathered together information from all the CSL units at universities on Canadian campuses. And that reading, which I'm in the midst of, is very telling indeed. So let me just start with a bit of a definition. This is the one put forward by the Canadian Association for Community Service Learning. And it's one of the longer ones, but I think it's one that I'm drawn to. So CSL integrates service experiences within academic courses or extracurricular programs, and UBC has both. There's a strong emphasis on inclusive partnerships between universities and nonprofit community organizations. Clear objectives are set forth for both the student learning and for the community. Effective CSL programs help students connect real-life experience to more theoretical discussions and study in the classroom. I'm thinking of some of Awad's comments about theory here. These innovative programs are designed to connect the resources of universities, the energy, intellect of university students, and the frontline experiences of community agencies to better understand and address critical social issues. It's one of the definitions that comes as close to actually identifying social justice as any of them. It's been a huge movement in the United States, and it's been taken out more recently in Canada and within the last decade. And indeed, there's a recently established Canadian Alliance for CSL, which now has over 30 Canadian universities. Now, CSL at UBC is really moving along at a great pace. Just let me mention a comment from the Place and Promise document, because community and community engagement is very much on the rhetorical radar, at least. UBC exists for the communities it serves, local, provincial, national, and global. An integral part of these communities, the university enters into relationships where decisions about needs and ends are made collaboratively, costs and benefits are shared, and learning is reciprocal. Beginning with interest and outreach and moving through engagement and empowerment, UBC In the 2010 report by Margot Fryer, who is the director of the Learning Exchange, she noted that 2,000 UBC students have been engaged in this form of experiential learning. And the different sites include the downtown east side and other parts of Metro Vancouver and smaller communities in northern BC. Some of the activities that they've undertaken have included involving elementary school children in writing poetry, doing science experiments, building vegetable gardens, facilitating Aboriginal song circles. There's research being done for neighborhood houses to enable them to support immigrants more effectively. There's tutoring of high school students in academic subjects, in after-school programs, and there's also helping small businesses to develop marketing plans. And more than 60% of the students at UBC do their work as part of a course. And the number of students actually doing this kind of work increased 30% over the last year. One of the comments that Dr. Fryer made and addressed to my class was that, and I asked her why she thought it was increasing, and she said it's purely from the demand of students. So now I want to speak briefly to some of my review of the literature and the reflections from coordinating 14 students within their CSL experiences. This next section could be a full shelf full of books, and indeed probably is, but I just wanted to problematize the notion community, which is a term used a great deal in a whole variety of contexts, including the selling of condominiums, and it has multiple meanings. Just take a walk around Vancouver these days and notice how often it's actually implicated in marketing. So Francisco and Pilar is here, argue that community is nearly bankrupt as a concept because it is often romanticized and currently applied to almost any gathering of persons, ideas, and products to add a patina of authenticity. So we need to trouble this notion of community. So the question, do communities benefit? So by far the most dominant orientation in the literature and in all the research is to study what outcomes of student learning, the outcomes of student learning. And indeed, some of the things that have been identified as a result have been things like active civic engagement, global citizenship, cultural understanding. A lot of career connections can be made, and actually the development of very specific skills. But there's much less attention given in the literature to what does the community get out of this. There's a current study being done at St. Francis Xavier University, points to some interesting preliminary findings. So the communities find engaging with CSL enables them to build stronger links with the university and bring in more youthful presence in their agencies. But they also noted the time it takes to orient students and wondered about the benefits of CL to their actual clients. So one book that is focused entirely on the community, which was edited by Stoker and Tryon, is called The Unheard Voices. Community Organizations and Service Learning. And in this book reports on a study where they conducted 67 interviews with community staff. And the key themes that emerged were the goals and motivations of community organizations, finding and selecting service learners, structuring service learning, managing service learning, and projects, diversity and relationships and communication. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes on some of their findings. In relation to motivations, 4 main motivations are identified, and these are by community players. Educating the service learner, long-term motives for the sector and the organization, capacity building, and developing a relationship with the university. The most difficult issue named were the challenges of short-term service learning projects. And indeed, the temporal dimension of service learning persists as one of the key issues throughout the literature, and indeed I think it has very strong ties to what we might think of in relation to the imperialism of service learning. Finding and selecting service learners was another theme. Organizations found service learners through websites, through service learning centers, professors presenting at classes, and volunteering, attending fairs. And they found that recruitment was more successful, the relationships were stronger, and some also relied on professional connections, and some of the community-based staff or alumni themselves. It's interesting to note there's a preference for graduate students rather than undergraduate students, as they were seen, undergrads were seen as less mature professionals and motivated and focused. And younger students were often seen to work from a charity model and didn't understand nonprofit cultures, but they really appreciated youthfulness. If students were in it just for the credit, there was usually a negative outcome. Finding the best fit was the question of whose need is greater. It's interesting that they noted the student learning or the organization service needs, and whether the student was seen as a volunteer or a service learner. And many organizations treated the student as volunteer or staff. That was the case in our current course. The distinction between service learner and community service or volunteering was greater for faculty than for the organization. In relation to structuring of service learning, short-term service learning, as I've noticed, was an issue. One semester is too short. The main challenges were time investment, differences in university and community schedules, short-term service learning, and direct service were just not compatible. There was also the issue of clients having to deal with the loss of students that they had created bonds with. Organizations in particular expressed worry about youth who needed commitment and to create trust. Managing service learners included the challenge again of time and resources. How much time and resources can an organization give to train, supervise, and evaluate volunteers? Organizations requested clear expectations in order to supervise, and some organizations would have preferred formal agreements. In relation to training service learners, 2/3 of the organizations in this study did some form of training, and the others provided none or little. They noted a dialectical tension between the academy and the community. That is, the organization cares what the student comes into the organization with, and the instructor cares what the student leaves with. Despite their needs, organizations, interestingly, usually deferred to what the faculty needed, which was an orientation to student learning and growth. In relation to communication and partnerships, mutual understanding was a huge challenge given the differences in the two cultures. In relation to pace, structure, language, and time. A better understanding of the other would positively impact the partnership and allow for greater understanding and standards of reciprocity. Communication was said to be often ignored and not a large part of the service learning literature. The issue of diversity was also a significant issue. These organizations noted a lack of diversity among students and faculty, as well as concern that service diversity needs need to be more than just changing the student demographic or having a diversity plan. And as they quoted, diversity is possibly the thorniest issue facing service learning in higher education today. And they outlined at the end of this study 3 principles for successful community service learning: commitment, communication, and compatibility. So what about social justice? In my preliminary review of the university, social justice is not named once. Civic engagement, global citizenship, self-understanding, diversity, and respectful relations are identified. Social justice is not on the radar, at least the official discourse. In the CSL literature, this absence is raised, but then again, social justice is often not even defined. So one definition that we can start with is the one from Iris Marion Young, who speaks about the full participation and inclusion of everyone in society's major institutions and the opportunity for all to develop and exercise capacities and realize choices. So to deepen the consideration of social justice in CSL, feminist intersectional analysis is important, and it directs attention to structural dimensions of power relations, moving past liberal notions as evident in views of CSL as a form of charity. Without this orientation, there's great potential for CSL to become part of the structural and everyday reproduction of domination. Bringing critical race theory to bear on CSL is also a significant contribution. It leads to a deeper analysis of benefit or harm to the community because it is about examining inequities through an intersectionalized race perspective. And we need to examine the racialized context of benefit to the community and question the impact of privilege on excluding voices of color. One of the ways I've been thinking about framing the notion of social justice is through Nancy Fraser's notions of redistribution, recognition, and representation. One of the dimensions of inequality is economic, where in some groups, communities, and institutions have access to resources while others do not. So to address this requires redistribution. The second dimension is based on the problematics of recognition and respect for differences. And the third dimension focuses on the politics of representation and the creation of mechanisms for equal political voice. So from my view of literature and websites and my experiences with CSL teaching, I would say CSL is somewhat moving towards a more equal distribution of resources. It's because CSL universities are redistributing academic resources to the non-academic community. I would argue what needs much more attention is the politics of recognition and how CSL engages with and recognizes community groups' needs, capacities, and their knowledge and pedagogy. There is some literature emerging that points to CSL as a form of co-teaching and co-learning, which is welcomed. Structural analysis of community struggles is key to moving toward a social justice agenda, and this is lacking, I would say, in the literature. The politics of representation, which is closely tied to the two previous dimensions, is I would say, one of the areas where there's little work being done. While some institutions have moved quite far along in establishing more formal structures where community agencies and members have a legitimate voice in CSL, a great number of them do not have such organizations. Let me close, because I'm running out of time, with Ivan Illich. I'm going to quote from a speech he was invited to give to the Conference on Inter-American Student Projects. Now, this is back in 1968, but it seems to still hold with time. He was surprised that he was invited to speak to this, given his critiques of paternalism inherent in any voluntary service activity. And he described the Conference on Inter-American Student Projects as a benevolent invasion of Mexico. This is a bit of what he had to say. You, like the values you carry, are the products of an American society of achievers and consumers, with its two-party system, its universal schooling, and its family car affluence. You are ultimately, consciously or unconsciously, salesmen for a delusive ballet in the ideas of democracy, equal opportunity, and free enterprise, among people who haven't the possibility of profiting from these. If you have any sense of responsibility at all, stay away and go to your riots at home. Work for the coming elections. You will know what you were doing, why you were doing it, and how to communicate with those whom you speak. And you will know when you fail. If you insist on working with the poor, if this is your vocation, then at least work among the poor who can tell you to go to hell. And it is profoundly damaging to yourselves when you define something that you want to do as good, a sacrifice, and helping others. I'm going to skip over my comments about force. And just conclude at the heart of moving towards a social justice orientation is ongoing respectful relationships across all dimensions of CSL, community, students, educators, and the university. We will make mistakes, and we must learn from them. Learning from them requires that we are in conversation with others who feel they can let us know when things are working and when they are not. These are difficult dialogues that require much humility, a quality that universities and those who occupy them are not known for. Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk about the experience of women at the Philippine Women's Center, and I will not pretend to speak for those women, but I will speak about our collective experience, if I may. I also wanted to share that my studies in gender and women's studies were inspired by the work of the activist work that we did at the center. So in a way, it illustrates this dilemma, this tension between theory and practice, and the sites of academia and community grassroots organizations. So I won't go through all this. You can read it yourself, but there are two key ideas I thought that would be great if you could leave with them. One is the method of work that we use in terms of storytelling and narratives. And I'll go into that for a bit more. And the other is to really try to, how does that look like when we are trying to theorize our community actions? And because activists need to theorize, and at the same time, it's that spiral method of how the frames that we've heard today have been really helpful in terms of theoretical frames, as well as our actions informing theory. So I hope I can share with you just what the praxis might look like with a marginalized group, a particular group of Filipino women in community. And perhaps also help enlighten what community might mean in this context. So we're trying to create our own history and how do we do that? You know, we can all kind of say this. The first point is that the belief that this is such hard work and painstaking work to do some socially transformative things in the world, but the knowledge that we ourselves are transforming through the struggle is critical to understand the process itself. The idea of going beyond opposition is also pretty interesting in the sense that a marginalized activist community could get quite caught in the idea of countering the dominant, which is really important. But on the other hand, it's how to go beyond this opposition and start putting forward what we're doing today, which is trying to put forward ways that other communities, other groups of praxis do it. And in that process is we have to build capacity through that struggle, and we become our own leaders and our own teachers and so on. So I'll talk about one particular project that we're finishing this year. It's a 2-year Violence Against Women project funded by Status of Women Canada. So that has a story in itself. You know, again, this sort of marginalized group of people applying for this federal grant, and on it goes. So there are many activities involved in this project. And the storytelling is certainly the important one. Documentation, and there are 2 students right now, one through women's studies and another in educational studies, who came with their learning goals, and then we respond to these, and we sometimes can be very directive. But these 2 women students have helped us in documenting the stories and in doing a workshop on how to do a video project. We're moving more intentionally in articulating our arts-based activities because when we talk about language and expression, we find that we need to find this expression that isn't just in the language of the host nation or the nation to which one has immigrated. And that last point, I think I mentioned that because how we can participate in just and genuine ways in Canadian society has evolved as well. there was a period in this organization is now 20 years old, and there was a period where we had to assert defining our space and naming our issues. But we can see that we're now moving towards being active participants in Canada. There are still settlement issues, and that will go on for a long time, but the integration issues are certainly becoming more prominent as second and third generation Filipino families come to Canada. As you all know, there was a paper in the Globe and Mail recently that the Filipinos are now the #1 migrant immigrant group, considering the size of the nation and so on. So it has a direct bearing on Canada's immigration and labor policies. So when we say empowerment and capacity building, what does that really look like, and how do the narratives help us? So when we sort of define our own issues and carry on with our own methods of work, we find that certain things happen, and that is that it firms up our standpoint, and we appreciate the complexities of our struggle. We are able to expand our own identities because we are now a transnational community, and we expand our authority in terms of our. We are the ones who are knowledgeable about our issues. We then take responsibility for oppositional and our proactive capacities, and these become our ground for our actions. We are able to do the critical examination of dominant beliefs and methods and still be attentive to what we're putting forward. I think I have a separate slide on narratives, but so this is who we are, and we educate ourselves first at the same time that being part of Canadian society, we educate everyone in that sense. These are the issues that we struggle with whenever we're invited to situations or we're involved in a collaborative project with academics. That has really helped us in terms of defining all these collaborations help us define our own history and our own identity and assert what our contribution is to that community-based academic research. We talk a lot about our social transformation and what that means, and we've all talked about that here today. We use the methods of participatory action research and the methods of popular education. So lots of experiences there. So in looking more at narratives, especially those that come from marginalized experiences, yes, it is based on lived experience, but it's also subjective experience, and it becomes a method where we are able to interrogate and create some tensions around the dominant discourse. It is community-based and participatory. It is reciprocal and dialectical, regardless of who we are engaging with, even within our own communities, as many of you would appreciate. Within the so-called ethno-cultural community, we're having to constantly negotiate and be reciprocal in terms of the members of that community and our own history of migration and our settlement in Canada. Mr. Music? So in terms of the reflection aspect of popular education, these are our questions. I mean, these sort of almost more meta questions of the questions, because we need to be aware of what our own questions are And where did these parameters come from? Because we're fully aware in our trying to decolonize ourselves that the questions themselves may already have been shaped in some way. So there's this constant reciprocity and dialectics around the struggle and what we put forward and what we learn from others. And then the basic question of why are we even here in Canada, and how did we get here, and how did we happen to be displaced and uprooted? And then the other side of that is in our migration history, we're beginning to see that these may not be the questions, these may not be the only questions, but rather now, how do we become a known and participating entity in Canadian society? I attended an IWD event for, the remarkable women that City Hall puts out, and there was a talk at City Hall, and the question there was, why are there not enough women in public office? And after we sort of fleshed out that this was all kinds of women, then it became clear that there are so many barriers to why women don't participate in the political process. At the same time that there are questions around the way the political process is structured for marginalized women at this time. And the analysis is, in this VOW project, for example, the analysis phase is pretty critical. From the time that we put forward the proposal and the periodic assessments that have to be done, our analysis has to be contextual. The stories are very personal and subjective, but they are also collective stories where issues emerge. The very project of violence against women came out of the experiences of women, and one of the contributions of that project is to bring out the economic violence that women suffered, and that's an example of how that issue came right out of women's experience. And you can see there the rest, and the analysis is always related to globalization and capitalism and globalization and globalized economics. LAPIDA, I just have to share this with you, that's a Filipino acronym. Filipinos are really well known for acronyms. There's like 15,000 acronyms. And LAPIDA is to help remember, liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. And LAPIDA actually is a Spanish-Filipino word to mean a tombstone. So this is part of the analysis we go through, and this is a whole nother discussion, but on women's experiences, and when we have focus groups and storytelling workshops and interviews and surveys, this is what comes out at the end. We have to assess what we've learned in terms of policy engagement. What are the policies? What's the legislation? Why do our experiences sound like this? And when we trace it back, we end up with analysis that's quite, it deepens our analysis each time. So, you can read that. Okay, so similar. And the social and cultural aspects of our expression. There's a musical that you're all invited to. That's the end of this Violence Against Women project, and that's going to be held on May 21st. And the issues that are coming out of the skit, the play, and the musical, the songs, the dances, are all based on the analysis that had been done. Oh, that was that. So thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and the privilege to be able to share this with you.
very stimulating presentations. So I'm sure folks want to stay a little bit and have some Q&A with the panel. So any thoughts, questions, statements back to the panel? I found them really interesting from all the three different perspectives. Yes.
I've forgotten the name before, but the second speaker,
Shauna?
thanks to all of you, really interesting. I just had a question about community service learning in universities, and do you think that the push, like the kind of record you read out at the beginning of how much universities are putting community into their spiel, if you will, or how they market themselves as a kind of engaged space, how much that affects the huge jump in courses that you mentioned, there's 30% more students this year, or last year than the year before, and how much of it is actually demand that you said, Marco, mentioned was the case, or is it a combination of the two? And do you see any kind of negative possible impacts of that kind of very quick growth in the university for like the quality of their things?
I think both of those sort of sites are influencing the rapid deployment, use that term carefully, of CSL. I think there's opportunities, I think, to, in a sense, appropriate some of the declarations about community engagements. They're in place and promise that can be quite beneficial. What concerns me sometimes about the scaling up, which is indeed what was requested a couple of years ago, they wanted to scale this up. I think it's the current, there was something I read on the service learning website of UBC. They wanted 30% of undergraduate students to have engaged in some kind of course-based service learning. I think what worries me there is the nature of, the kinds of relations you need to establish, which take time, which take a particular kind of, as I pointed out, humility and I think orientation. I think there's lots of people here that have been doing that for a long time, and I see them in the audience. But I do worry about, on the one hand, institutionalization can bring you resources that are very important and needed, and on the other hand, it can lead to a kind of a universal notion of what it might look like and what it entails, and not respect the nuances and complexities of things. I do worry, and it's almost Friday. I start off Monday as being optimistic, by Friday I'm pessimistic. I always have fun weeks, that one of the things that I do wonder about, which I probably didn't articulate very well, is how much the university is now burdening the community with its responsibilities for teaching. And at the same time, I say that with saying that there's limits to what can be learned in these spaces and places. So the scaling up, I wonder, I haven't yet seen, although I've heard that resources are going to be made available to community, right, to enhance their capacity. But is it enhancing their capacity to deal with CSL students or to do the work? I mean, those two are not mutually exclusive, so it's a bit of a ramble about what you think.
Yeah, I have a question for Marilou, actually. One of the things that's pretty amazing about the Philippine Women's Center is, the youth who work out of that center as well. And, there aren't many centers that can actually do this, have the activism at this kind of multi-generational level. And that's really something, very fantastic about the Philippine Women's Center. So I wonder, are there any kind of challenges to to that, or I just wonder what the internal discussions might be, how much people work together, the kind of the women who are working on domestic workers' rights groups, domestic workers' rights issues, to the youth. Like, how much interaction is there? It's just really fascinating watching it from the outside.
Well, I think there's quite a lot of interaction. I think part of the background of that is the labor and immigration policies. It brought Filipinos here in different waves of migration. And so the Canadian-born youth are children of the wave when professionals, particularly professional nurses, went straight into nursing jobs. And then there's now the youth who are the children of live-in caregivers. So those are different kinds of sort of groups of youth. At the same time, when you look at the community itself, the gender, race, and class intersectionality is present for everyone, so that the youth experience what their parents, particularly their mothers, experience in terms of those intersections. So that the youth speak a lot about their racism and anti-racism work, whereas the women will speak about their economic barriers. So I think as a community, the stories end up naming similar issues. But the sectors perhaps take hold of different aspects of those issues based on what they're experiencing. The live-in caregivers, for example, of course experience racism. However, when they tell their stories, that is not what's prominent. What's prominent are the sacrifices that they're making, and family separation, lack of housing when they finish the contracts. They're de-skilling, they're being stagnant, their inability to move forward. The youth will speak a lot about racism experiences. The men will bring in different issues as well. So I think that the history of the community is another thing that brings the community, the different groups together. So at the center, depending on which sector, which group, the youth or the women or the migrant workers are leading the action, everyone's there. So there is that awareness of the specificity of some of the experiences, and yet these are all issues that involve all of the members of that community. But I think you're right in that unless the youth are involved, this is not really a movement. This is not really going to go anywhere.
Yeah, but can I just say something to that?
Sure.
Yeah. Most of the immigrant communities here, and immigrant, of course, is used in a racialized way because, it sticks to racialized bodies. But, the pattern is that second and third generation will do what you're describing, laugh at the accent and kind of move away, in the South Asian community, move away from those fresh off the boat, right? But it seems to me that what the Philippine Women's Center does is really counters that in practice. And it's a really good example of third world feminism in practice, right? Because third world feminists have never treated women as individuals only. Community is central to feminist politics. It's not just separating women out and make them hate their family and their community So it just seems to me that the Philippine Women's Center is really a really amazing example of that kind of third world feminist in practice. And one of the ways you can see it is through this multi-generational. And I'm just really amazed when I look at other immigrant communities how the center is able to kind of be open and accommodate all these politics at these different levels and different generations. And it really is a pretty amazing example. Yeah.
I think the method of experience and analysis, I think, holds it together, because no matter who's participating in an action or in listening to a talk. I think that everyone learns how to do that.
It's also class, right? Class makes it
Yeah.
better.
I was actually hoping to go back to, Shauna, what you were saying before about the university making resources available to community organizations for service learning. Because I guess before coming back to school, I had been working with community organizations who were recipients, if you will, of these community service learners from high schools and universities. And while some of them were fantastic, other of them I felt like I was babysitting, or that it was ironic that the student was paying tuition perhaps to an instructor that was earning twice the salary, and I had to put off my own work to take care of the student. And so now that I am going to be teaching within this college system, feeling torn about whether community service learning is something that I want to pursue, because on the one hand I do see significant advantages, but on the other I feel really scared about putting that burden on community organizations who already have a whole lot to do.
Well, I think that awareness is really an important starting point, and having been, in the location you just described, and I think that's where you start the conversation. You really start to recognize the time and resources that are required by the agency, and you figure it out. I mean, you don't want to presume what they need in relation to resources. You don't want to presume their reading of the situation either. So yeah, you just start and acknowledge it and say, what do you need? And what would enable this? Recognizing the time and energy and knowledge and skills. The institutional knowledge that's held in these agencies is, I think, poorly recognized. So it isn't just time, it's like all of those nuances that you have, that you understand. So I think like Foucault said, it's not whether it's good or bad, it's just all dangerous. Move, eyes wide open, I think, and hopefully conversation wide open. But even sometimes finding time to have a conversation. I mean, the time is the biggest issue that came up in our course this term. And I wouldn't do a single term course ever again. The students are struggling. I suppose that Jennifer and I are really kind of, not having such a difficult time with it, although we're doing a great deal of linking up with agencies and stuff like that. So, I don't know, that's my response to, I think it can be profoundly of benefit to all involved. And I think we need more stories, maybe like what Oliver shared us, of what that looks like. And we can't put a recipe on top of that.
Well, I just wanted to add that this is part of the issue for me with service learning is just how many people are not talking to one another. I mean, I was at the University of Tennessee for 10 years. I taught courses in service learning. There was a model already in place. The university decided that it was going to jump on the service learning bandwagon. And about 5 or 6 professors were handpicked, not of course including those of us who were doing social justice work, who were already doing it, and they were flown to different universities around the country to learn about service learning models. All these issues, the issues of time, the issues of who's doing this, how they're doing this, not making this into one model fits all of these kinds of things that people have been struggling with. People don't talk to one another about what they have been doing and what the work has been that is on the ground. So the idea of service learning being under-theorized is an issue. There are people who are theorizing it. The idea of time, how long it takes to offer a real service learning course, what's involved in it, how do you bring theory into it. All of those things are things that different people have been working on in different ways, and not enough people are speaking to other people about what their model looks like. And not enough time is taken to make up a model with enough flexibility within it for people to engage with it. And even things like, where's the impetus coming from? Right? I mean, it works a lot better when it's community organizations that are saying, we would love for students to come in, rather than when the university goes out and says, we are going to bring in students. The issues that you're bringing up are so relevant because people say, I don't want to babysit. That's what it ends up being. But there are models that have addressed some of those issues. Is UBC looking at those models? No. Even within departments, we might not all even know who has a background in service learning and who doesn't. These things need to be talked about, worked through, and the institutional models I am just very wary about because they don't do what I would call service learning for social justice. Anyway, just my own little spiel.
I'll pick up on that in your comments. I think community and organizations who are, I think trust is a big part. I teach 2 courses on this campus. One is an organizing course. I was in the same position as you, worked in nonprofit social justice organizations where we knew what it took and the impact and so on. And just recently I've started to think about CSL. And UBC currently, and I think this is part of what Shauna was responding to, in terms of how flexible. So when an organization actually comes to you because they trust you as an instructor, you have a relationship with them for years, and they say, we want to work with you on this, it's not always necessarily UBC. Maybe people come to you, Shauna, because you're Shauna, right? So I think that's a really important part of it. But in this case, when I went to the community service learning body at UBC, they're pretty confined in their policy and how they work. It is not as flexible as we hope it would be. And in this case, it was with the Memorial March, the Missing Women Memorial March, who said we're ready to come on this campus to do a panel. And we were beginning to develop a project of archiving the Missing Women Memorial March from the beginning, and that was going to be the project. So we worked through that, but when the Memorial March said we would like to be with students, educate students ourselves, rather than maybe a department about the missing women, CSL was not open to a group of women who would never have set foot on this campus, and for the first time in 20, 30 years, mostly indigenous women said, we're ready to come and do this, and they were not open to it. And I remember saying, you need to take this to your